A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome to yet another exciting session on forensic accounting and assurance standards. Very proudly, I would like to tell you that the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India is the first in this world to pronounce forensic standards. And let me tell you, your institute, which is a constituent member of IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, have on 30th March 2020 guidance on and then I am proud privilege and for upon all and we use the word of
नंदा जी आपका आवाज ठीक से नहीं आ रहा।
Am I audible now?
Yes,
Yes, sir. Now you are audible.
Yes. So, gentlemen, these forensic standards were coined after a lot of deliberations, not only from people from the profession, but people from and other investigators also. Ground are now getting a backspace, and it is time when we all can create opportunities in forensic. Let me tell you, the statutory audits can go, but forensic is something which will remain in the future, and therefore knowledge of forensic standards as an institute would put us at a different perspective altogether. I want to very candidly state here, you're all aware that your institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, was set up an Act of Parliament way back on 1st July 1949, when the most important document to the democracy, the Constitution, was not adopted. You're all well aware that the Constitution to this great country was adopted on 26 January 1950. The pertinent question that arises is, what prompted the Constituent Assembly to set up an Institute of Chartered Accountants of India when its own democratic setup was not in place? The answer is very candid, very simple, very forthcoming. They were looking for a disciplined band of soldiers to steer this country out of confusion. And ladies and gentlemen, today we have so many things in store for you, in store for the entire economy. Even the investigative agencies like SFIO, like Economic Offence Wing, CBI, they are also in touch with the Institute over certain matters. I have been longly associated with the Institute, and I have seen the stature which Institute enjoys when it comes to knowledge sharing. So I was very keen and I requested Shri Satish Shenoy ji, Shri Sailesh Kaushik ji, they are people who have spent their entire life into this entire process. So I requested them so that if we have luminaries who could guide us, would be at a better perspective. Before I conclude, I would like to tell you that your board is presently involved in rendering services at your beck and call. This year, I have taken as Assurance and Accounting Board, DAB, and Internal Audit Standard Board. And in DAB, we have coined one very important action point, which is putting technology to the doorsteps of accountants. I want to tell you, there are certain people who are not technology savvy. So we have taken a very right impetus to ensure that any chartered accountant who's not technology savvy is brought to the institute training so that he has technology. I had a meeting in Mumbai on 4th with our faculties, and we have decided that now we'll go for advanced courses both in FAFD and information system audit, so that people who are working in the technology space would have a better perspective for the benefit of membership at large and for servicing our clients. So I take this opportunity to thank you all. I welcome both the learned speakers who are on the dais now, Sailesh Kaushik ji, Satish Shenoy ji, and I welcome all of you, the participants who are the most important ingredient of this seminar, this webinar. Without you, any initiative of the board cannot be successful. And I promise that I'm only a phone call away. The board is only a phone call away. My Honorable Vice Chairman, CA Dayanivas Sharma is only a phone call away. Anytime you need anything, we are there to serve you and do our best. So not taking much of your time, I'll give the dice back to Shri Amit Gupta for further proceedings. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I wish this conference a great success. Over to Amitji.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your words of wisdom. And now I request CA Sailesh Kaushikji to start the session.
Amiji, are you able to see a slide?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Very much, Mr. Kaushik, very much. And you're totally audible. You can start now.
Right. And Amiji, in this, if there are questions, I understand you will pass them on to me.
Yes, sir. Definitely, I will send you all the questions which I received from the participants. Yeah.
So this is a new topic, and like Nandaji so beautifully articulated, I think it is a very proud moment for all of us that we should lead the accounting industry globally in something. There have been 1, 2 standards from different institutes, maybe in Canada, Australia, even in the US, but as a comprehensive set of standards covering the entire framework of forensics, this is definitely a first, and we should all be very, very proud. And not only it's just because it is first, but it's also so relevant. Whenever we look at the paper, almost every day you get something like a fraud related, financial defalcation related, some news item is there, and somewhere there is one of our colleagues who is doing that kind of investigation. Now, before we get into the standards per se, I think I generally start out by making a look at what we call these standards. We've called them FAIS, Forensic Accounting and Investigation. The word audit does not figure. It's a very, very important takeaway, and it's the only takeaway on this slide. There was a very careful decision to keep this away from an audit, to make it a completely different discipline. There are multiple differences between forensic investigations and audits. Simplest being audits are time-bound, audits are planned, audits are regular, they are statute demanded, they are management demanded. Forensic investigations usually are caused by an event, as a result of which the investigation is done. The scope is not very limited, it's much more deep. It does not go to giving a view or an opinion, it gets into transactional details. And we are not bound by what is required in an audit, which is why we come to the standards which are unique to forensics. And let's also spend a minute on the word forensic. One thing I think we should be clear, there's a lot of use of forensics with frauds. But forensics as a discipline has very, very many positive connotations. For an example, intangible assets. Forensics is a good way to value them. If you have your accounts destroyed, if you have your server destroyed, you have an accident, you have a fire, you have any act of God, if you want to reconstruct accounts, forensics is a wonderful tool. If you want to do due diligence, forensics is a wonderful tool. So I just mention this so that we don't have a connotation that forensics is only associated with fraud detection. All right. Now, what I will be covering today is the preface, the framework, the basic principles. And the Institute has come out with a book. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see this? I don't think so.
We are able to see that, sir. We are able to see that. You can again.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so this is the standards which came out on August 21, and a very elaborate process went through these standards in terms of a large group of individuals contributed to making the standards. We had a review group going through the standards. We put them out as per the institute processes with great rigor for review. To the public at large, we also sent them to various bodies and stakeholders, MCA, CAG, SEBI, and a whole lot of other people. We sent them for opinions. The opinions were reviewed. The team again deliberated on what suggestions should be taken and why which should not be taken. And at the end of it all, it goes again to DAB. And after it's reviewed by DAB, it goes to the council, and that's when it comes in the form of a book. So a lot of rigor and a lot of effort has gone into the standards. And basically, it's divided into the preface, which tells us what it is about and why you have the standards per se. Now, one of the issues, not just in India, but everywhere, is the expertise of the forensic discipline in accounting has always been questioned by courts. And the court decisions go by expertise by asking you, number one, is there a body of knowledge which these professionals refer? The second question they ask you is there a test of reproducibility? That is, if two people use the same kinds of tools, would they come to the same conclusion? Like if you do a blood test, no matter what lab, by and large, if they use the same method, you should get the same result with the same sample. So these are the things the court started questioning when forensic experts came in to give evidence. Now, we're not as far ahead as the medical profession in this regard, but the publication of standards is one huge step towards discharging that responsibility of a common body of standards, methodology, and related documentation. After the 100 series, these will be covered by Satish sir and I think Anand Jangid sir. When they come, I'm just giving you the 300, 400, and 500 series. Now, what the preface sets out is the objectives. What can the regulators expect? What are the basic standards you would get? What quality are we striving to get out of the forensic reports? And one of the questions I will address is, this comes up many times when we discuss reports. What constitutes a report? We actually do a lot of reports. We do interim reports. We do draft reports. We do draft presentations before a committee. And finally, we give what is called a final report. So people ask me, do these standards govern the final report? That is a matter of interpretation, and mine is that no matter what report you submit, if it's a report from your firm, whether interim or draft, you're bound by that report until some new evidence or discovery happens or another channel of review opens. Then, of course, that portion of the report may get revised. But as of the knowledge, information, and data you have at that time, when you submit a report, it by and large should meet the standards. It is also expected that going forward, we will come up with implementation guides and technical guides, which will be more related to the how to do the investigation. This is more, the standards are more from a point of view of what is expected. So the standards in the preface, there is a common structure. Each standard has an introduction, tells you what it's about, what does it cover, why is it necessary, what are you required to do, explanations, any documentational requirements, any procedures, and then there is an effective date. As of now, there is no effective date. The standards are recommendatory in nature. And once we familiarize them through conferences like this, and more people start adopting them and giving feedback on how they work, then it would be the council in its wisdom would decide when and which date they would be effective from. We covered this briefly. The topics get selected, there's a timeline for each standard, then it goes out for review. And like I said, it's a very rigorous process. And I think Satish was part of it for most of the time. And when it comes to his time, he would definitely tell you about how much debate and how much discussion took place around specific sentences and sometimes even specific words. So a lot of rigor did go into this. The next structure part of this is the framework, which starts with definitions, then introduces some of the forensic accounting investigation concepts, develops a framework. And as far as ethics is concerned, we're all chartered accountants. We stay governed by the code of ethics, which applies to everybody, including a forensic accounting professional. So when we look at the framework, we talk of basic principles, concepts, standards, and guidance. And overarching amongst all this is your code of ethics, which is fundamental. We talked a little bit of forensic accounting and how it has positive connotations. And the other aspect which we should keep in mind when we deal with standards is it doesn't matter what is happening today. At the back of a forensic professional's mind should be that this is likely to get into litigation. And our entire effort, including planning, evidence collection, preservation, analysis, should be keeping in mind that we may be subjected to litigation at some time, which is where the forensic tools come in very handy. We covered forensic accounting and investigation. Litigation is another aspect of this discipline. And it's a process of handling or settling disputes before a regulatory body. You can also have alternative mechanisms like arbitration. That's also a large area of this discipline which is opening up. Now, finally, let's talk about fraud. Three things are essential to the definition. It has to be a deliberate intent. There has to be deprivation of money or property through deception or any unfair means. Now, I'd like you to spend some time looking at this definition, because this is what distinguishes this discipline from anything else. In our regular accounting or audit world, our task ends when we say that the accounts do not present a true picture of the events. or when we say that a profit is understated or overstated, and the related qualifications. That is the end of an assignment in that world. But when it comes to a forensic investigation, that is usually the trigger and the starting point for what you do. And that there has been the establishment of overstatement, understatement to some extent is sometimes done, sometimes it's expected. But the larger expectation before our community is to prove intent, is to prove deliberation, is to prove what we call the flow of funds, or the diversion of funds, or the siphoning of funds, which is where this discipline takes a different path altogether. This covers also the attributes. On the right side, you have the attributes which are pretty similar to any professional. You should be independent, integrity, professional care, maintain confidentiality. Confidentiality responsibility is much larger for a forensic professional comparatively, and skills and competence, of course. And as far as skills and competence go, the institute has already been doing a lot to develop IT and technical and other skills through various courses conducted by DAB and by the institute. Nandaji, in fact, has assured that these are going to go much further, and we're going to take technology to the doorstep of people and their offices. So as far as skills and competence goes, and the attributes go, those are results of training. Now, conduct is what we do. And these I would like to spend a little time before we get into the next phase. Contextualization of the situation. I mean, whenever I attend seminars on fraud investigations or related topics, 2 or 3 of the things which people tell me are, if somebody works very hard compared to others, there's usually something wrong. If somebody works weekends, there's usually something wrong. If somebody works midnight, there's usually something wrong. It's a generalization, and in our world, it's called a red flag. What contextualization means is, if it's tax filing time and it's a CA office and a deadline is coming, it's expected that people would work late. So taking the facts and reporting them out of context is something we should be very careful about. That is what is meant by contextualization of the situation. Office load is light. There's hardly anything to do. Most people find it difficult to fill the 6-7 hours we have. Usually something we talk about mid-year, when the bank audits and all are done and we're waiting for the tax season to start. That's the kind of time you expect. You find it unusual. Primacy of truth. We'll deal with primacy of truth when we talk of hypothesis again in more detail. But what it basically means is Satyameva Jayate. Truth has to always prevail. Some truths conflict with our biases. We come with a preconceived idea that this is what should have happened. Some facts or other things come before us. We don't give them the importance they deserve because they're not fitting into my theory. That is very incorrect. I will give you more examples of that when we do hypothesis. Respect rights and obligations. Everybody has rights. And we have the obligation to respect those rights. You can't take data from somebody's computer when he's not looking. You can't photograph somebody's bank statement by pointing out something at the window and your colleague takes the photo with the mobile phone. These are not what we call respecting rights and obligations. There are methods to conduct an investigation. There is a method of evidence discovery. There is a process of collection and preservation, and it should be followed. Because the easy way is almost always the very difficult way in the long run. If you have not collected your evidences by respecting someone's obligations, it's unlikely that such evidences will be recognized in a court of law. Fact from opinion.
ये तो सब शामिल करते हैं ना, तो ये
Amit, I think you should mute. Thank you. Separating fact from opinion is, let me give you a very simple example. A particular customer is the top customer for 5 years. Every year, the sales to him have been growing exponentially. Similarly, there is a supplier who supplies continuous top supplier in a particular product category. And if you take the supplier, his comparative rates are higher than his competitors. So there are two facts. He charges more than other suppliers for the same product, and the company buys from him regularly. These two are facts authenticated by the data. You think there is something wrong, that is an opinion. You think it is a red flag, that is an opinion. So your forensic investigative reports have to have more of facts and conclusions and much less of opinions. And another dangerous trend we see in some reports is they are mixing facts and opinions. So you can't tell one from the other. And the last one, of course, is to continuously improve. All right. We've done forensics, audit, and investigation in terms of difference, so we'll skip this one. And the first thing is to understand the mandate. So whenever we start a engagement, we should know what is it about. First thing is clear, like we mentioned, it is not an audit. Now, when we talk of it is not an audit, I think it's worth spending some time on, if I say in this forum that it's not an audit, if 5 or 6 people say that it's not an audit, it's not going to stop the bank, for example, from asking for a forensic audit. It doesn't stop the RPs from calling them and appointing forensic auditors. So there's a large change management process involved. Whenever we talk on this subject at different forums, we try to distinguish and explain to the persons that why the audit is different and why these do not classify as an audit. But we understand that there are compulsions. If there's a tender for an audit, if somebody calls you for a forensic audit discussion, you would go. But we think that over time, when our community goes out into the field and explains to the stakeholders what the differences are and why we would not like this to be referred as an audit, things will change. It will not happen overnight, but it will. The other thing I do personally is try to remove all references from audit in reporting. The mandate, the letter, the tender is not in our control. The report is in our control. So to the extent possible, control your report and call it an investigation. If it's an investigation, if it's a forensic assignment, call it a forensic assignment. And if it is a litigation support, call it a litigation support. And it is possible, and it is usually the case, that your mandate will include elements of all three of these items. There will be forensics, there will be investigation. Sometimes there would be some kind of litigation support. And the litigation support usually comes from 2 or 3 items. One is, let's say we investigated a loan fraud. And it transpired that the conclusion was there was a fraud and maybe funds were siphoned. Most of the time, the borrower would go in for some kind of litigation. And the bank or the institutions that appointed you would look for some kind of support to answer any queries arising out of your report. So that could be in a court of law, it could be in an arbitration, it could be in an internal bank inquiry, but there is a scope that it could happen. But what is important is, before taking up the assignment, it is necessary to understand the spread of your engagement. What all is it going to cover? And what this will basically let you know what is going to be your scope and what are the kind of skills you will get and what is the kind of skills you'll need, what's the kind of data you need to look at. So when you look at nature of engagement, you would definitely need to look at it in detail because that is the first step to the other standards. Now, this is a very important concept, which is fraud risk. Now, fraud risk, in my understanding, comes at 2 levels, very broadly. One level is what I call the individual level. The second level is what I call the industry level. And both these kinds of risks need to be evaluated separately. Now, no matter what technology does, what technology can do, and where technology is going, the driver of technology is a human being, which is why I put the individual first. Then we look at the industry. Each industry has its own unique characteristics, for example. You could have banking, you could have oil and gas, you could have services, you could have pharma, you could have textiles. Each of them is a completely different ballgame in terms of what are the fraud risk areas. There are, again, I'm not trying to make this sound difficult. There are common areas with respect to all these places. Now, when we look at fraud risk, transportation used to be a risk. Loss in transportation, manipulation, fake supplies, fake transport bills, for example. These are common across the industry. But the kind of transit losses depend on the product which is transported. So to understand how an industry works is important when you're assessing the fraud risk. And then you need to assess which are the areas. Is it the warehouse? Is it manufacturing? Is it job work? Is it the procurement? Is it logistics? Which are your areas where fraud is likely to occur? And there's another word here. It's called a fraud indicator. We're used to calling these, I think, as red flags, green flags, which basically means that something is out of order or that something is too good to be true, which is a red flag or a green flag. Now, it's a little more fashionable to call them fraud indicators. Now, behind each fraud indicator, it's important to look at a position. So in your assessment of an industry, you've identified the warehouse. You've identified procurement. You've identified, shall we say, job work as risk areas for fraud. So what are the positions that man these areas? And then start looking at, then if these are the key areas of fraud risk, what are the kind of people I will need to be able to do this? This is a very, very important part of planning and engagement. For example, if a lot of the work in a particular area is going to deal with Forex, and the primary concern areas are trading, and there's also commodity buying, selling in futures, I personally do not have great expertise in that area. So if the fraud risk relates to an area which is not in your expertise, I would suggest that's not an assignment we should be taking. And the reason is, the person who is likely to be perpetrating the fraud is going to be an expert in that area. If we do not even have a basic understanding of how it works normally, it is going to be difficult. A very seasoned professional could possibly get through it with very strong data analytics. But even they would have to spend a lot of time and effort in understanding the industry. I'm not saying it can't be done, but if it's not an area you're familiar with, it would require a lot of work in terms of understanding the industry. The second aspect of fraud risk is in terms of how would you understand that given a particular area, what is the potential that a fraud could occur and how far could this fraud spread? It's what I call in my parlance as spread, which means that is the area you will have to work with to figure out if something is wrong. And how will you come about or analyze this would be out of hypotheses. So when we deal with hypotheses, we will talk about that. The third standard talks about laws and regulations. Now, when we look at our standards, we're looking at laws and regulations from two aspects, basically. One is what I call a direct impact law. And the second is what the standards refer to as engagement specific. Direct impact, an example I could give you is the law of evidence. A word which we use often is called evidence discovery. There are rules for discovery of evidence. There's a procedure to collect evidence. There's a procedure to ensure that evidence is preserved in a manner in which it is not tampered. So word for it is called chain of custody. Then again, there is a concept of data privacy. I just can't pick up somebody's bank statement. I just can't go and look unless the person whose bank statement it is authorizes me to look at it. Now, this is an ethical conundrum which all investigators go through. In many of the industrial towns, the company owner is a very influential person in that town. So he can possibly get you the bank statements of most of his employees and suppliers. Is that legal? No. Is it acceptable in a court of law? No. So those are the direct impact laws. There are also what I call engagement specific laws. Insurance, banking. We're all familiar with the RBI Master Circular, banking acts, electricity, foreign exchange, insolvency, prevention of corruption, environment related, money laundering. There are multiple laws which are specific. So at the time of evaluating the work or discussing with the client, all these standards relate to the beginning, at the first stage. What is the specific legislation which is impacted? What are the direct impact legislations? What does the scope involve compliance with any legislation? Are there any contractual arrangements which are violative of legislation? And while the standard is very clear, let me maintain that the real world is very gray. Unfortunate, but it is true. For example, I will give you an example from some of the things we do. Related parties are very clearly defined. But there is no definition, for example, that I run a company, I'm the promoter. I have a particular employee who hosts my cash ledger and coordinates with the bank for statements and maintains emails and addresses discrepancies and does all that kind of, shall we say, clerical work. That person is a director in one of the companies with which our company deals, is what I mean by a gray area. And we should be very careful in reporting on such gray areas. Stay with the facts and keep away from opinions. The opinion which a person may have is very clear, but the only facts are that X employee works with XYZ company on a salary of such and such for these duties. All these can be documented from the payslip, from the job description, from his salary grade. From the MCA side, you can document that he's a director in a particular company. That company deals with XYZ, and the level of dealing and the volume of transactions can be documented. Before making any further conclusions, we need more evidence. So this is an area where we know the law is clear, and still the facts may be clear, but your opinions and conclusions can be gray. Next item. On complex and important matters where you don't have the expertise, please feel free to seek advice. There is a provision to take opinions. And the last bullet is very significant. I am seeing this more and more with forensic investigation reports. In the sense that many cases, a very good investigation doesn't meet the test of law because the person against whom it was drafted did not get a proper opportunity to respond before action was taken. And usually, especially with our stakeholders, there is a lot of hesitation to share the report with the, let's say if it's a loan case, the borrower. And the fear is he will write to so many people, he will do all this, he will make everybody's life difficult. But if the report is not shared, the consequences are even worse. In a couple of cases, the court has thrown away the report because the person did not get a chance to respond to it before action was taken. So this again is the basic principle of natural justice, that if there is an accusation, the accused has to have a chance to respond. Okay, I have someone telling me that the video is not working. Is that correct, Kunal?
No, sir, it's working fine, sir.
Okay. Okay, someone has asked whether standards are implemented. They are recommendatory in nature, and they will be made mandatory after an announcement by the ICI after they have been in circulation for some time. Okay. The last standard I will be discussing with you is what we call discussing hypothesis or applying a hypothesis. Now, it's as a concept, it's a very old scientific concept, which basically talks about making a set of assumptions or a theory about what has happened. Now, when we talk about a forensic investigation, hypothesis becomes a little complicated. Now, like I said, there's always a predication or an event which triggers a forensic investigation. That somebody thinks that something has gone wrong, which is why we are called in. A bank loan has gone bad. The bank thinks that funds have been diverted or siphoned off. The management raw material costs are going very high. He thinks that there's a procurement fraud. Inventory losses are very high. So they think there is pilferage. Transportation's costs are very high. They think there's a lot of round tripping going on in terms that means you're paying for trips which didn't occur. Unnecessarily large amounts are being paid for job work, for work which perhaps could have been done in the factory. These are all the kinds of things on which we are called upon to do investigations. Now, the most important thing is, it's very important to understand the person who is appointing us. and where they are coming from. And what is it they suspect? Because obviously, if they're spending money on an investigation, their triggers and hypotheses are important. But it's equally important that as investigators, we're not biased. We need to formulate our own hypotheses. And I generally have two starting hypotheses. The first one is very common. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Second one is equally simple. Everybody is guilty until proven innocent. So I have a box with all the people, and my hypothesis will cover and clear individuals. And I talked about individuals at the beginning, and I classify individuals into layers of organization: top management, middle, and lower management. And you can add layers in the middle depending on the size of the organization. And now I evaluate these in terms of fraud risk to define my hypothesis. At lower levels, there are usually multiple transactions and smaller values. At higher levels, there are fewer transactions, but a very high per diem value. So that's how you correlate your fraud risk and come to your hypothesis. Now, the other thing about a hypothesis is it cannot be vague. This is going to be what is driving your investigation. So let's assume there is a possibility that there's a procurement fraud. So we need to check vendors, whether one particular vendor is getting more orders compared to others. We need to check whether the rates are at variance with what is available in the market. How do you know market rates? Commodity exchanges give you a lot about rates. And there are lots of industry numbers on rates. Rates is not as much of a mystery number today as it was a little while ago. Information is becoming more and more transparent. But the essence of the hypothesis is it should consist of a series of testable statements. And something very important, you should be able to prove, disprove, or not prove. Prove, disprove, many people understand. I have received questions on what is not proof. Sometimes you may not discover enough evidence to be able to decide one way or another. In which case, not prove is the best way to go. Let me give you an example. A lot of times we do insolvency-related cases. In some of them, the promoters have abandoned and gone. What you have is the insolvency professional, RP. He has captured certain data in a couple of computers, which he claims to have been the accounting system of the promoter. He also, with the help of the bank, has seized some factories, some plants, and some machinery, which is under lock and key. And they have access to a couple of ex-employees of that organization who are willing to cooperate. And in this circumstance, you're asked to do an investigation. Sometimes it's enough, but at other times, it's not enough to make a categorical decision. So that we were not able to prove or disprove is an option. Now, the other thing about hypothesis is it's very, very good and structured to work with a hypothesis. But we should be aware what are the problems of a hypothesis. A hypothesis comes with its own set of problems. For example, we tend to like our hypothesis very much. And that's when it gets dangerous. when you start liking your hypothesis, you look only at data which supports your hypothesis, which is why I said your set of assumptions basically needs to be a bunch of statements which can be validated. Procurement price is higher. So you need to establish, is it higher or not higher? If it's not higher, then come to bullet 3. It needs to be flexible. If this hypothesis is not working, we should start with another one. And I know multiple colleagues who work with alternate hypotheses from the beginning. It makes the investigation a little complicated, but it covers more ground in less time. And it depends on how you are comfortable with an investigation. Very seasoned investigators, a couple of whom I've dealt with, prefer to do alternate and multiple hypotheses because it also keeps the client guessing. They are not very clear in which direction this guy is going. And it's important that people don't know how your investigation actually goes until you're done with it. So that is the concept of a hypothesis. So in a procurement context, you could set up assumptions about vendors. You could set up assumptions about lot sizes. You could set up assumptions about rates. You could set up assumptions about frequency. You could work with economic order quantities and multiple. And here again, I would say in all your hypotheses, cover different layers of management. Don't lose sight of the people behind the process. And to be correct, don't use people, use positions. What are the weaknesses in this position? What are the weaknesses in this position, in this layer? That way, you would be able to test your hypothesis a lot better. I think I'm coming to the end of my time. Is there any questions, Amit? I'll be happy to take, or you can go to the next. Is Anand here? Or is it going to be Satish?
Amit,
Satish, you have anything to add while we wait for Anand?
there's nothing. I mean, you really covered it very well. You went into the granularity of each of the standards. That was good, and nothing specific to add.
No, I mean practical issues. I tried to cover some of them, but we face a lot of practical issues when we try to do these things.
Yes. Very true.
And since this is more in a webinar mode,
Correct.
we're not getting the questions directly on the chat.
Yes.
Which otherwise you would. But yeah, we need to be clear that real life is always slightly more complicated.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you brought out that point about that this is not an audit. So this is something beyond an audit. It is something different. I think that aspect you brought out very well, sir. So, I think Amit is busy on something else or
what? Sir, CA Anand Prakash Jangir ji now will be taking the session on 200 and 300 series. So he has just joined.
Hi, Anand.
Hello, sir. How are you?
How are you, sir?
All great, sir. All great.
Satish, Anand is my first teacher in forensics, in case you didn't know.
Arey, no, sir. Salish, sir. What is this? Nothing like that.
Yeah, it's something Satish is not aware, so I thought I will tell him. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to welcome and hand over to Anand, my first guru in forensics. So welcome, Anand.
Thank you, sir. So I may share the screen. Okay, I'll just share the screen. One moment, please. please. So, a very good afternoon, everyone. And hello, Satish sir. Can see you. How are you? So, it's always great to be with Satish sir and Shailesh bhai. Both of them are, some of the doyen of the forensic, or I would say audit, sector, and it's great to be here. And without much ado, I'll start from where Shailesh bhai has, mentioned. He has already covered the 100 series, and I'm sure I'm not going into all the things because Shailesh bhai and Shati sir will actually be able to provide more background to how the series came into picture. I'll just concentrate on two things: the 200 series and the 300 series, and some of the finer points of that. Especially, I would say 300 series are the most important in my view, because that's where the executing of assignment comes into picture. And so, friends, let's deep dive into this. And in the next 1 hour, which I have, I'll try to do justice to both 200 series and 300 series, and give you my input on all of the standards which are there, and what was the thought process behind them, what are the final points which we should be aware of. And as I would say, forensic accounting and investigation professional, there are always some areas or some gray points which are important to cover, and that's something which we need to be aware of, because that differentiate between a good professional and an average professional. And those things I will try to deep dive into that, not on the verbatim of what the standard says and taking forward. Now, we all are aware of this part, so I'll not go into that. So the first is the 200 series. Now, if you see the naming convention itself, there was a thought process behind 200 series being the engagement management series, which basically means when we are actually taking over an engagement, what are the do's and don'ts, how we should be aware of. And as standards are something which are very important, they bring it up a kind of standardization as well as a kind of a basic baselining, and helps the professional to do their work better. Engagement management series basically help us in terms of ensuring all the I would say proportion before engagement has to be taken over by that. So in the engagement series, the first standard is FAIS 210, which talks about the engagement objective. Now there are, and I'm sure already Shailesh bhai and Satish bhai would have told you about that the fundamental thing in forensic accounting and investigation standard, which start with, is to tell everyone that, okay, it is the forensic accounting and investigation, not a forensic audit. And that fundamental has to be always brought out. Now, from that perspective, it is also very important that the engagement objectives are clear. And it is going to happen with all of you who are actually going to be already in practicing in the forensic engagement areas, or planning to go for that. You are not going to get the similar engagement all the time. There are engagement by banks, which is to fund the fund trail. There are engagement which are given by IBPI professional or RPs. There are engagement which is given by corporate, which is more of from a perspective of day-to-day management. There are in corporate itself, there are audit committee engagement which are differently dealt with. So it's very important to set the responsibility and objective of each engagement which we are getting into that. And FAS 210 tries to do that in terms of setting up the thing. Now, the key objective of this standard is to bring a clarity on the primary purpose of the engagement. Now, is this engagement about investigating siphoning of money? Is it a kind of engagement to find the fund trail? Is this engagement where we are trying to bring out depositor money? Is it an engagement where we are doing something else? So it can be in any other thing. So that is very important, that we should be clear of primary purpose of the engagement. And similarly, we should be also clear that the objectives or the scope is consistent with the objective, which is clearly defined. Now, when I say clearly defined, I would like to bring out a very important thing. we would see scope of work which are very rightly defined, that okay, these are the expectations from a professional, and there are scope of works which are also very vague in nature. So we have to ensure it up that as much as possible our scope of work and our engagement objectives are very clear and consistent and are well defined, because there should be a very clear what is going to be the expected outcome. It is something like we do in many of our engagement. We give, okay, this is going to be the input, this is going to be the processing, what we are going to do, and this is going to be the final output. So it's the expected outcome, and the nature of it has to be clearly discussed with the stakeholders so that everyone is on the same page. It should not happen that just because there is a forensic review, we are guaranteeing that there is a fraud and we'll figure it out. So that is the key things in objective. If you see the requirement on the third point, the requirement is to make sure that your understanding of the main purpose of the engagement is clear and you and client are on the same side, and it is documented, because it cannot be an oral engagement and all things. And the inclusion and exclusions are very clear. Now, it may look like a very, I would say 210 standard looks like, okay, this is a very basic standard, but it's a very important standard. I'll tell you why. Just see the line number 3. It says ensure expected outcomes are in line with objective and defined scope. Now that, there was a lot of debate on this requirement. What we are trying to state out here, and what are the collective brains of most of the professionals which were discussing was very clear. They wanted to ensure it up that whatever expected outcomes or the result of the engagement we are talking about, it is in line with the objective and defined scope. There should be no disconnect between what is the end result coming up and what is activity which has been planned up there. And similarly, it is not designed to commit any particular outcome since the dependent on facts and evidence, because we cannot be designing the whole engagement to commit that, okay, we are going to get information or any points against that person. No, that is not going to be that, because as any engagement happens in a forensic or in accounting or investigation standard, we are trying to bring out it very clear. So that's the kind of set of requirement. And in FIS 210, friends, what we try to deep dive into from a documentation perspective is the need of this engagement, which should require in terms of examination. Any initial correspondence, minutes of the meeting, or other communication has to be documented and kept with us. What was the idea? There can be addendum to the scope. There can be changes to that thing. So any amendment on other things has to be clearly documented, because there are standards which talks about documentation requirement and all things. And from that perspective, when we are going into the 320 series, you will understand that it has to be clearly documented. So that is FIS 210 for you, friends. Going forward, we have FIS 220, which talks about engagement, acceptance, and appointment. Now, it's a very interesting thing. If you see the scope, I would highly recommend you to read the bare standard, and you will see when we mentioning the scope, it says you have to agree on the term of the engagement considering the degree of sensitivity and a very important word which we are all aware of, inherent risk. When we say inherent risk, is an inherent professional risk we are talking about whenever you are getting into that thing. So before we agree on the terms of the engagement, or which is the terms of reference which is there, it is very important to understand those parts. And as a professional, we need to do our due diligence, taking it up. If you are aware of that, when we are dealing with something which are PEPs, which is politically exposed persons, or people who are having some other affiliations and on all the things. So we need to have a complete, I will not say complete, but a basic due diligence done before we accept that things. And also the key terms are clearly agreed upon. So, it has to be mandated by the standard that we should be putting it up, the draft engagement letters which is there, and a consent has to be documented from both sides. So a copy is there with them and copy is there with us, and it is a documentation requirement. But more importantly, we need to understand the complexity of the engagement. It should not just happen that, okay, there is a document been created, we just, without going deep dive into that, we just try to do it, and there are something which are against the law, and that can actually create a problem for us. But on the same side, when we are doing it, there are some inherent risks which we have to factor it in, and based on that, we need to ensure that we understand the ultimate use of the outcome of the stakeholder, how they are going to use it up there. It should not happen that we are doing something which is actually against the law. Like, let's say example, I'm just giving you one example here. may not happen, but before there is a kind of a short thing that there is a forensic review of the client has been dictated by a court or anyone, and before that the client wants you to do a review and tell him what the weaknesses which are there so that he can fix it up. Now these are actually kind of a little gray areas. We need to be very clear about what are the expected outcomes of this, what is the objective of the things, and based on that only we need to decide on that. And this part is also very important, that your engagement is not designed to commit any particular outcome. It's not an outcome based engagement, because it's always based on what are the facts and evidence which we need to bring up. So I would say FIS 210 and 220 are very much related, because one of the things is talking about engagement objective, and the second one is talking about your acceptance and appointment. And friends, moving forward, when we go to FIS 230, now here, this is the interesting one, because it is talking about using the work of an expert. Now, fundamentally, as chartered accountant, whatever we are, we have been using it, we know fundamentally one very important thing, that even if you're using a work of an expert, you are, liable for the work. That is actually as per the essays which are there. But there are some nitty-gritties in this standard, FIS 230, which I want you to understand. So let's deep dive into that. The first point is on the scope. So the engagement, when of using expert to assist in engagement or any of the things, there can be different types of experts. There are experts who are handwriting experts. There are experts who are document experts. There are experts who are, functional expert. Like for example, if I'm actually doing a review of a refinery, I don't know isotopes how they are used. So there are people who can actually, bring it out there. So first, the definition of experts is also very important. Second, the objective very clearly is, I can actually get technical assistance, both on evaluating my evidences or doing my procedures on a complex area where I want to basically work on. So those things, I can actually do it better if I can actually get the help of expert. To give an example, there was one case where we have to do some investigations on, for one of the company, which was an infrastructure company, and setting up railway lines under the, some projects. And we are not an expert in how much sand is going to be used, how much crushed stones are going to be used in 1 kilometer of railway line. Now there you have to get some experts who can be a railway engineer and all things, who understand the nitty-gritties very well, and they can actually establish and specify, in what manner. You should be very clear that, okay, this guy is going to give me what is going to be cost of raw material or use of raw material in 1 kilometer of railway. That's the only thing he can actually help you. He cannot help you whether what happened next and all the things. So that part is very clear, that we need to establish and specify in the manner in which the expert is used. And that scope has to be clearly documented. This is the role of the thing. We have to have clearly, because you have a non-disclosure agreement with your clients, and which is usually a kind of case in all the forensic engagements. So it becomes important that you also have a back-to-back, a confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement with them. You should have your proper documentation in terms of scope, what he is going to do, what he can be called up. And those documentations are very important. The requirement which comes up is of a little different nature. The requirement which we are talking about here, that the professional, he has to make an, I would say, an independent assessment of the expert for whether he requires it up. And because ultimately the whole, I would say, judgment which is going to happen, or the report which is being worked, it is, responsibility of the forensic accounting professional. So he should be making sure that he understands it well, and based on that only the decisions are taken. The second point, which is there is, to appointing an expert, we should make sure that there should be a kind of a, if it doesn't have the authority to have it, let's say, for example, due to some reason the client has barred him from doing anything as such, those part also we need to be very clear about. Okay. And the third thing which comes is whether he's really an expert. Now that becomes a bigger point, because in the court of law, how do I prove that this guy is an expert? And that's why the work has been, delegated to him. Like, let's take example. I was taking as example of this railway engineer. Now that guy is a retired railway engineer with around 36 years of services in railway. Now, you may always question it up. In cross questioning, the defense can tell me that, okay, you are saying he's an railway engineer, but he was always only working on not laying down the railway lines, but he was actually working on electrification of railways. So now that is a different area altogether compared to what we call it as laying down the railway line. So that evaluation has to be clearly done and ensured of that. Now, whatever the report has to be submitted by the expert, that also has to be checked for proper, is it sufficient, is it reliable, that guy, whoever is submitted it is correct or not. So that is something which we covered in FAS 230. Friends. Moving forward, one more thing which is very important in FAS 230 is talking about the independence and objectivity of expert. Now, we go with an assumption, independence and objectivity is taken for granted for the forensic accounting professional, but we need to also see the relationship between him and any personal interest which we have with the organization. If that guy is working with that organization only and says, okay, I'm an expert and I'm going to give an expert opinion, I would not value that expert opinion at all. And also, when we are doing this, there can be a question raised, and that's a very valid question, that how can you evaluate the adequacy of the work of the expert? Now, that part is to see the review, the process, report, and findings, and discussing with him. Though you cannot be 100% sure about that, a due diligence from your part is important. Now, then we come to the definition of what is an expert. So an expert is an individual or a person representing an entity who has some special skills or domain expertise. And it can be along with some relevant experience also in that domain or field of discipline. Like, for example, whenever any accounting related work comes, we as chartered accountant are professional accountants. So it becomes, taken for granted that yes, this has some amount of what we call it as a professional expertise in this domain, and that's the reason people can do that. So that is one of the key things. So, but checking out the background, making sure you have the proper reference check on the reputation and other things of that thing, that is one set of documentation which has to be kept, and it becomes the responsibility of the forensic engagement, or forensic accounting professional to ensure all these things are taken care of. Okay. So this is what we cover mostly in FAS 230, friends. FAS 240, which is again a very interesting one. Here in FAS 230, we are talking about engaging with agencies. Now, when we are talking about engaging with agencies, a lot of people had, a doubt that say FIS 240 and FIS 360, which talks about testimony in front of a competent authority, are very similar. I would say that is not really true. Let's try to deep dive into this one, FAS 240, and then I'll take you to FAS 360. You will try to, you will be able to understand the difference, what is there in this two standard out there. So the first part is the scope, let's say. So, let's say, for example, some agencies has appointed a kind of a professional to do some kind of thing. Now, this is engaging with agencies is only going to work when you are not engaged, where you have been called as an expert witness for any court of law by any agency. Let's say, for example, there are a lot of cases where chartered accountants are called to be an expert witness by the law enforcement agencies to try to work it out there. But here, these engagements are apart from those engagements, because expert witness is a kind of a different service altogether. Whereas here you are trying to engage with the, I would say, agencies for some specific purpose. So the objective is clearly, we need to have the certain protocols has to be followed. There are legal aspects to that. There are also roles and responsibility of when you're dealing with the authorities of in this matters. And how do you provide the evidence to the agencies? So here, the agencies can be any of the law enforcement agencies, or there are also quasi-judicial agencies nowadays. Like say, for example, in Karnataka, there is one Karnataka Protection of Deposit Act and other things. There is a competent authority out there. Now, they have a different kind of role to play in any kind of fraud involving deposits, right? Now, also we have the requirements under this. So the requirement is that very clearly that you should be aware of the objective and scope of the plan procedure of what you're going to do for them. There should be a clear understanding of laws and regulations which are governing the respective agencies, because in India, this is one of the big challenges. We have a lot of regulations, laws and regulations, and each of them has to be looked into in the right perspective and then dealt with that. We have to be aware of the roles and responsibility in the presentation of facts, how it is going to matter, because it is possible that the IO or the investigating officer is going to be the main guy who will do it, and you will be basically a sidekick providing him with all the support. So we need to be very clear in terms of dealing with that and take that forward. Okay. Now, also in this case, our terms of engagement with proper scope, this is a standard, I would say, documentation to be maintained. Also ensuring that your chain of custody, especially in physical and digital evidences, so anything has been handed over to you, how you are giving it back to them. Tomorrow, there should not be question card raised on you that, oh, this was a kind of evidence given and it was not returned back and all things. Non-disclosure, this is a standard thing in every engagement. And most importantly, I would say there should be a proper retention of all this physical and digital form, all communication which is happening, including I would say taking backup of your WhatsApp chats, or if in case you are doing it on that, because many of the time we have seen agencies also saying, okay, for this case we'll make a WhatsApp group and do it. I'm just talking from the practical problem which you will face on the ground, and that is something which we need to be aware of. Okay. Moving forward, friends, let me go to FS 250. So this is the last of the 200 series, which is communication with the stakeholders. Now, communication with the stakeholders are a very important part, because there is not going to be a one-time case. It's like, there is going to be a multiple stakeholders who are involved. So it should be done in a laid down process in a proper manner. So the scope of this one is very clear, that what is the way we deal with the, communicating with the stakeholders. Now, there are primary stakeholders, there are other stakeholders. Now, primary stakeholders are always the appointing authority. Now, appointing authority can be law enforcement agencies, it can be a corporate body, it can be audit committee, you name it, any of the thing can be that. So how we are communicating with that? Also, one thing which has come, which was actually debated for a detail, that the responsibility is to communicate always directly with the primary stakeholder, because he's the person who is there. But also the standard applies when you are dealing with other stakeholders. Now, other stakeholders can be anything, it can be people who may be interested in this. It can be by matter of law, your report. Let's say, for example, my primary stakeholder, my appointing authority is a bank. But this is actually a bank fraud which has happened, where there can be a kind of, directly or indirectly, we'll be dealing with that. I'm dealing with law enforcement agencies also. So they are also one of the stakeholders. They may not be directly reading my report, but they may ask for some of the information from there and take it up there. So here we need to have a clear definition between what we call it as the significant matters and essential matters. So essential matters are basically meant for your engagement execution. So it includes the scope or methodology of the engagement, your written process and protocol of communication over mail, over phone, how you're going to do it. What are the laws and regulations which are applicable to that? It is also dealing with the support and cooperation which is required. Let's say you are actually appointed by the bank to do a forensic audit of one of the large loan which has been given, and the gentleman who has taken the loan is not cooperating with you at all. Now, what do? Should you just give a limitation and do it? No, there is a process to be followed. There should be escalation mechanism. Whom should you reach out to them in case they are not helping? Whom do you reach out to? Your appointing authority. All of that things has to be looked into. Also, are going there be any recurring reporting? Do we have a interim report to be issued? What format we are going to provide all the reports? So these are the essential matters which are there. But there are also some significant matters which we need to deal with. And these significant matters, friends, comes from any kind of significant delay from the stakeholders, and which is going to happen depending on what kind of engagement you are into. Some engagement you can call the shot, some engagement you cannot do that. If, let's say, for example, due to some reason you want to interview some of the person and they said no, you can't do that, so there's a prevention of access. or they are not providing you with some information with files which are related to that. So those things has to be our significant matters. This has to be communicated. Before it come in our report, it has to be something which we have to communicate as per the laydown process and a predefined and pre-agreed protocol. And when I say predefined and pre-agreed, this comes from your engagement, detail documentation. So it is to be clearly outlined. If there is any kind of potential conflict of interest with any stakeholders, we have to ensure it is communicated. Any kind of alteration or destruction of evidence which you have actually come to know about or anything, that has to be done. The chain of custody of any evidence, there's a term which will come again and again. And in the interest of time, I'll not go into that, but you'll understand this is like documenting where the evidence was, in whose position that was, and that is something which we have to also do that. And also, last but not least, safety and life-threatening situation, which touch wood, I would say it should not happen to you, but this is a part of I would say inherent risk of any of the engagement which may happen. So you need to take care of those parts and has to be communicated. So the most important thing here is all communication has to be professional and clear in direct manner. And the way you're communicating, it has to be essential matter. There has to be communication in a formal manner. The other part which is there can be looked into from perspective. So friends, this is all about the 200 series. Now, as we mentioned, 200 series is all about more from the engagement management. How do I manage the complete engagement? But the moment you move it to the 300 series, this is the execution of the assignment or executing the assignment. What are the standards which you need to follow in executing the assignments? And these standards are something which are really very interesting, guys. And I would request you to deep dive into that. I would say these are also the bigger standard. When I say bigger standard, it's like if you go with the volume of explanations and other things which has been mentioned, 300 series is the most voluminous of all of them. To some extent, the 500 series is also there, but yeah, I would say 300 series looks to me more voluminous out there. So let's try to deep dive into each of these standards also. Now, 310 is all about planning of the assignments. Now, in 310, when we are talking about here, the scope. So the scope is all about the extent and the depth of what we call it as the planning which is required. It will depend from the complexity of the case or the work which has been there. So whatever the engagement is there, these are some of the definitions which comes up. An engagement. What is an engagement? It means an overall what we call it as a contractual. Let's say here this is the term which I was talking to. Overall contractual mandate between a professional and appointing body. Now, that is what we call it as. And when we say an assignment, because that's also one of the key word which comes as part of the planning of assignment. So it basically means some part of the engagement or a portion of overall engagement. So engagement, assignment. So this is something which is very interesting, that you need to understand the complete picture or difference between what is an assignment and what is engagement, because assignment is a kind of a subset of engagement. That's how it has been, thought process of going out there. So the key elements which is there is it should be specific in nature and should cover the specific area or scope what has been actually thought for. Many times it can be, prepared by the professional, but it should be an ongoing thing. It cannot be a static document, because what happens with the part of your engagement, there are things which are going to change. And the key objective is very clear. It is basically ensure that your overall scope of work, is made sure that there is a proper planning which is gone into that. We have factored in all the risk factors which are there, and the work methodology has been rightly thought for, as well as any kind of evidences, the different diverse source where we can get the evidences from. Let it be the digital evidences or physical evidences. We have already thought of that. And the skills and resources and timeline which we require. So that has to be dealt for in the right manner. Similarly, when we are doing the planning of assignments, the documentations is very important here. So the requirement is clear that you follow a laid down process and document the outcome based on the theme. It will be not a very static one. Again, I'm telling you, it will be a little dynamic, because based on your engagement, there are going to be things which are going to change, things which is going to come to the scope which was not there in the scope earlier, and those things has to be looked into that. So we need to plan properly. Let's say, for example, one of the clients we are going for is using SAP, so some knowledge of SAP deployment and other things has to be there, and based on that you can actually deal with how you're going to go for that. And your work methods which are going to do that, are they going to make sure that a proper in-depth you can actually follow all your assignment which has been done. So the documentation for this under FIS 310 is more from perspective of what are the process documentation you do, what are the tools you are going to use it up. You are also going to give a proper detail of what are the information which you've gathered for the business, for the processes, or system. Let's say, for example, I'm saying that you're using SAP system or Oracle EBS or Microsoft Dynamics, so we should know about that. Any of the meeting which you had with your stakeholders, we need to summarize that, have it enlisted. Also, based on your resource requirement and how much available resources you had, who are the people who are doing it, all this information has to be linked out in FIS 310. In the FIS 320 fence, that's the most important one because it deals with evidence and documentation. And all of you agreed to that is one of the 320 is all about the evidence and documentation requirement. And it becomes the complete crux of what we are going to do as part of our thing. So the first part here is the scope. The scope is very much on the responsibility of the professional to discover, and the appropriate and reliable evidences, and to maintain sufficient documentation for what are the tasks which he has done. The definition of evidence is information, which is either written or oral or any electronic form, which is relied by the professional to arrive to a conclusion, because ultimately it's a statement of fact. So we are actually trying to make sure that we have a proper statement of facts which is there, and based on that we can gather all this information from either in written form or oral or electric form. Now on the oral, you may say, is that a kind of thing? The point which is very important is whatever information, the test, I would say the most acid test of whether an evidence or not, is it suitable for the court of law? Can you take it in the court of law? Now those points become important in what we call as an evidences. Whereas on the other side, when we talk about documentation is the work done section. If you go to the reporting standard, you will realize when Satish sir will talk about all the other sections, other essays, FIS which are there in the 400 and 500 series, you'll understand that documentation here become the building block for your final report, because we need to have a written record of all the procedures you have done, all the conclusion which is there. And it can be coming from multiple sources. It can come from digital source. It can come from physical, oral discussions, or even confession. Multiple things can come into picture. So today we are also using a lot of analytics tools. Like there is fraud analytics is one of the key things. Now, when you're doing a fraud analytics, there is also kind of a very fundamental rule, and you will understand when you go to the 400 series, that whenever you're using any analytical procedures, you have to document it, and whatever procedure you have put it up there, any other person does the same analytical procedure, he should also get the same result. That is the kind of an acid test for that. So those documentations has to be clearly brought forward, and that has to be done. The objective here is to ensure that we are discovering appropriate and reliable evidence. These two words are very important things. Whether this evidence is appropriate and whether I can rely on that, because the test is it has to stand in the court of law. It is not just whether you are convinced or not. The court should be convinced of that without much clarification or additional information to reach the same conclusion as what you have reached. It should not be kind of on hearsay and all things, but based on a proper, appropriate, and reliable evidences. That is one of the objectives. And second one, which is on the documentation, is you should have enough documentation, adequate documentation maintained to ensure that anyone who would like to see your work or review your work should be able to arrive at the same conclusion if they go through your working papers and other things, all the documentation. So This become our key objective. And the requirement here is to ensure the same word I was telling you again and again, appropriate and reliable source. So you're getting it from reliable source and it can be stand in the court of law. And you are able to support this finding. This evidence will support your findings which are there, which you are trying to bring it out there. Moving forward, friends, in FIS 320, we have one more part which is very important, which we need to understand. And that is actually on what is an appropriate evidences. Now, this word becomes a very important, appropriate and reliable. So let me explain to you the word appropriate. So evidence obtained from multiple sources should be appropriate to achieve objective of engagement and suitable to produce in the court of law. Now, whatever we are trying to do, it has to be ensured that it is an evidence which can stand in the court of law. And even if you take it from multiple sources, let's say, for example, my phone record, you check it on my phone, it is the same detail. If I check it with my service provider, I get the same thing. Now, two sources, I'm getting it up. Now, I'm just giving an example here to bring out the point. And the reliability part will depend on a fundamental, which we all know. The fundamental thing is what we call it as internal and external sources. We all know this fundamental difference that always we trust more on information from external sources because internal sources can be tampered with, right? There is also oral and written. I would actually go on that thing, and based on the completeness. So reliability will be not just on one factor. There will be multiple factors which will play important role out there, and based on that, we need to look into and manage it out there. Okay. So this is what we should be aware of on the term appropriate and reliability. And there is also one more word which is used in the standard, and that is called relevant and sufficient documentation. So relevant documentation will cover everything, such as, most important, I would like to underline some of the things which brings out that clearly. So you should cover all the procedure performed. These are all examples. You should not take this the thing. What was the hypothesis? We have already covered hypothesis in the 100 series. The purpose and outcome. Now, these are the things which becomes important. And how you came to a conclusion, right, on a logical manner with reference to your observation and written in accordance with the legal requirement. So all these things become what we call it relevant and sufficient. The sufficiency has to be brought out there. Okay, so evidence has to be relevant, I would say appropriate and reliable, whereas your document should be relevant and sufficient in terms of how do we manage it. So this is FIS 320, friends, one of the most important FIS, which I would say, because it covers it actually touch upon all other standards also. So it's not just in one way, it is just covering it up. It has an impact on other areas also. Moving to the next one, the 330 series. The 330 series of FIS is actually on how do you conduct your work procedures. Now, it's very interesting. It's here we are talking in the scope of this one is how do you deal with the work procedures required to conduct an FAI assignment. So whenever you're doing an FAI assignment, what are the different work procedures which we need to follow? Okay, and already the planning part is done. So here we are just on the way of conducting the work process. So we need to have a planned work procedure to achieve the objective of the assignment. And we have already seen the last standard. What is the definition of engagement? What is the assignment? And here we need to be clear about, okay, this is the objective of the assignment and this is the work procedures which are going to do that. So if you want to see a kind of a, thing, as far as the FAIS, we have engagement, assignment, and work procedures. That's how the hierarchy is actually being built. And the work procedure has to be, executed for effective execution. Now, effective is a word which I think a lot of you would have heard about, but you should not try to match it with efficiency. Effectiveness is how correct or how correctly we can do that, and whether it's achieving its goal, that has to come out clearly out there. And we need to also look into the clarity of activities undertaken to either prove or disapprove, because ultimately there are hypotheses you have actually built up as part of your initial thing, and you are trying to prove or disapprove or not prove the hypothesis which has been formulated. So that is something which we need to bring it out there. So that is the objective of FIS 330, friends. To do next level where we talk about the requirement here, also one of the key things which comes into process is in one work procedure you may use multiple techniques or different tools. So you need to evaluate which are the different tools or techniques you are going to use it for that. It can be a digital forensic, or you have the 400 series which will be discussing about that. So what kind of different things are there? Can you take, let's say for example, I'm trying to trace a person where he was on this day. I can check his Google map. I can check his phone geotags. I can check his activity on Facebook, or I can see his laptop where it was, or mobile phone provided by the company where it was. I'm just giving an example. So there are multiple things which I can actually bring out the right area. So, or do I do some data analysis out there? So that evaluating the right, that would be the requirement of FIS 330, that in conducting the work procedure, we should evaluate the right or relevant tools which we are going to use and techniques we are going to use. And how do we bring out the or discover the evidences? Because we use the word discover the evidences because the evidences are always there. You're just trying to bring them up. In the same way, we have to also pay attention to any kind of fraud indicators, or what we call it in the common word or nomenclature, red flags. So there may be some red flags also which may be there as part of your work procedure, which may not be doing it up. If you are, I'm sure a lot of you are still busy with the bank audits this time. And there is a kind of a change in LFR, which a lot of people have appreciating also, that RBI is asking that you should also provide us with red flag account. There's nothing wrong in the account, but you think as an auditor, you think something is not okay. So just do a red flag so we can actually do a forensic review of them at a later point of time. So those things has to be basically comes under the fraud indicator part. Also based on the progresses which we need to see if we can have any change or any modifications in the whole process which you are following. So that becomes another kind of thing. For this purpose also, as usual in any standard, we have documentation to be managed, because FIS 320, it's actually focused on documentation, and you will see in every FIS, we have some or other documentation requirement is there. So the professional, whoever is conducting it up, he has to document the complete scope, the plan, the methodology of the work procedure which he is trying to do that. And if there are some kind of analysis which has come out with something, now there may be working paper, they may document things, there can be some digital evidences, all of them has to be properly documented. Now friends, there's one question which has been asked to me in one of the other seminar also. Let's say there are trial and error in any kind of FIS engagement. So in a FI engagement, if I'm doing something and let's say for example I did that, but there was no outcome of that, should I still document it? The answer is yes. That is the most important thing which I want to talk about here, is that if you have done some work, please document that. That has to be documented. Whether it is a successful, or it is given you something, or it has helped you in testing a hypothesis or not, that is not the point. The point is you did some test procedures or your work procedures. Maybe the output was not as per the expectations, or didn't go as per the plan, but still we should have the documentation for that. So in nutshell, you can say in 330 we have to develop the work procedure which will be based on preliminary analysis on all your detailed plan. We try to consider the fraud indicators. If you find in phase 1, you try to see that in phase 2, check it up again, revisit that point, test your hypothesis, which is nothing but you either approve or disapprove, or find evidence or discover the evidences for that. And based on that thing, you can actually change or update, or if required, bring experts also. So friends, FIS 330 is covering more on this area out here. Moving forward on FIS 340. Now here it is all about conducting interviews. Now there are a lot of interviews, and confrontations which are going to happen. And friends, as professionals, when we are communicating, and we need to always keep on back of our mind, we are not law enforcement agencies. We may work on behalf of law enforcement agencies, but we are not the law enforcement agency. So as a professional who is communicating or engaging with individuals, when you want to elicit some kind of information directly or indirectly, this all comes under the purview of the concept of interviews. I know in our common terminology, we use the word interview and interrogation separately, but here there is no difference which has been put in the standard. There's a reason for that, and I'll come later on that part. The requirement of this one, before that, I'll say the objective of this one, the objective of standard 340 is very clear. It's basically to seek information for corroborating evidences, corroborating the evidences which you have got. If you've got some evidences and you're saying it, we need to corroborate to that, right? We need to say that, okay, this is what we found. What is your statement on that? Or, as usual, which happens, you will draft all your questions beforehand and ask them and, record the statement so that it can become, maybe this is depending on what kind of engagement you're doing. Some of them are also accepted in the code, some of them are not accepted, but you have done your job in terms of admission by the concerned person and taken down all the information which is there. So a proper planning we have to do for that. It is not just we start with, okay, tell me something about ourselves. We see in many interviews with that kind of thing which happens. That is a job interview. It is not a job interview. Here we go with our homework. You would always see this, law enforcement agencies will say, CBI has 10 questions for Mr. Maran or for this gentleman, So there is a kind of a very clear set of preparation which goes. And that may be based on your work done so far, because you're corroborating that evidences. You're recording the statement and making your complete approach. And there is a methodical approach to be followed when you're doing it. It cannot be just, a random approach. In fact, there are a lot of courses nowadays which are there. I'm just giving a off the topic item, which even tells you how you should arrange the tables and chairs for an interview. I'm just giving an example on that. So this is a very important area, and the requirement is clear that you should conduct it with due preparations. You should develop a methodology which include, following the essential steps, like have you done your homework on that? What are your framed questions which are there? Do you want to be keeping it at open-ended questions? Do you want to have a close-ended question? Do you want to be a little confrontation mode, or do you want to do that? Now, it all depends on the objective of that engagement, how you'd like to do that. So I'll not go into deep into that. And the standard also is talking at a little high level on terms of that. But key things is a documentation requirement, which is nothing but interviews has to be documented, circulated to the right stakeholders, and one of the key things which is there is it has to be timestamped, because you will not know when this happened and all things unless there is a proper chronology of event of all. Also, declaration or signed statement has to be taken from your interview, so that tomorrow if anything happens, I know it will not be accepted in the court of law. Many of you people ask this question, so any confession by that person is also not accepted in the court of law. Completely agree, because now we are not a quasi-judicial authority, but it gives a lot of weightage to you in terms of your investigations, your work, your working papers and everything. And that has to be actually signed, or what we call a declaration to be taken, that that guy is not given the statement under any duress or anything as such, and doing that. And for the preparations and planning which we do, it becomes very important, friends, that there is a proper scrutiny of documentation. The questionnaire is correctly designed, because if you're asking the right questions, you get the right answers. If you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. So friends, it becomes very important that we do our homework very well in terms of, what are the things we are doing. Also the methods, as I told you, there are some fundamental themes on based of which you are doing it. Like I gave you an example. Some people prefer to have open-ended questions. Some people will draft close-ended questions where the answer is going to be yes or no. Are you in a confrontational mode, or are you in information gathering mode? Both the places you have to make sure your design of the questions are, right, relevantly done. And the basic principles are followed in terms of documenting it or doing your homework. And this is an evidence without inducement. So it cannot be like, okay, we'll try to help you. No statement like that should be made anywhere. That will try to, make sure you're not fired. Just tell us about that, guys, and all the thing. Those things become a little problem. And the confidentiality has to be maintained, because there are going to be multiple people. In fact, this is a very interesting thing, that confidential point was brought out, because many times what happens is some people, if they're helping the forensic engagement expert, later they get a problem from their organizations and all. So how do we basically take care of that? That it is not mentioned out there in terms of what it is. It will all depend on the engagement and how it has to be planned. The next one, friends, is 350, review and supervision. Now, 350 is another very important work, because here you are using a work of a team of people, an expert who are conducting the work procedures. So it's very important to have proper review and supervision of this. And 350 is a big standard. It covers a lot of points out there in terms of how do we deal with this. So the objectives are that all the work procedures are performed efficiently and effectively. I already talked about this point, and in line with the engagement and regulation. So here, one of the key things which comes into picture is the process of discovering the evidences. How did you do this? The data information is comprehensive, reliable. It should not happen that some of the information, let's say I'm just giving you, you got discovered these evidences by bribing someone, by doing it up. It can actually bring disrepute and more problem and legal issues to the forensic professional. So we need to be aware of that thing. And now I hope you know there is a data privacy law also which is come, and there are some sections of that which is not yet mandated. But if it comes, I don't know what is going to happen, because you have to basically inform the person before you start investigating him in indirect manner, not direct manner, but indirect manner. This is how the law is being drafted. We are not sure whether this will pass or not, but that's the point I'm just trying to bring it out here. Also, the process of monitoring the plan. How, whether you're going to have a weekly meeting, monthly meetings, or depending on how the long the engagement is, how the resource allocation is happening. What are the procedures which has been done? How the documentation has been managed for that? Whether it's adequate or relevant. That's a word which has been come again and again, and that has to be looked into. Also, the requirement of this FAS 530 350 is you use your best judgment for processing and reviewing the supervision in terms of the periodicity and all things. It's based on the judgment of the professional. And also, if there are any kind of changes which are there, so as per 310, you may have to go and reevaluate or make sure the some changes which is there. We need to rework on that. And the working papers which are there, the proper set or what we call the docket, has to be rightly reviewed, managed, and taken care of that. And the key documentation which you have to maintain, this is just to prove a point that yes, there has been proper supervision. It's not like the team did something else, you do just was somewhere else and something else was put into the report, you just submit it up there. So the review and supervision will be based on multiple factors, so those things has to be documented. And wherever you have reviewed it up, there should be evidence in writing with the reviewer details that okay, this document was reviewed by this person, so it is very clearly mentioned. So it also brings out something which we call as the first level of control before it goes to peer review. I'm just giving an example. I would like to have my own review done of all the documentation. So that is something which FAS 350 talks about. Also, it also talks about few more things which I want to bring out, some special points which are there. And the first one is on extent of review and supervision. So the extent of review and supervision will vary from assignment to assignment, because it will all depend on how complex it is. Some engagement are going to be very complex. Some of them, are very, very digital in nature. Some of them will be what we call it as involve, law enforcement agencies. Their work is going to be different. And similarly, there is going to be another way of manning this thing up. So these things has to be clearly mentioned. And one of the key things which will happen is that whenever we are, seeing this, depending on your engagement, different engagement, you would have different type of supervision, because there can be time constraint, there can be also on the competency of the team, there can be a point. So that has to be looked into. The second point is the nature and review of supervision. So what kind of supervision you are doing it up there? Is the supervision on the progress of assignment, timelines, budget? Is there a confirming the competence and capability of all the individual team members are as per the planned objective which you have set it up? Also making sure the completion of work procedures are appropriate and it's sufficient and it's reliable in terms of what has to be done. And similarly, we have to also see it is conforming to the standard, the relevant standard like FAI standard and laws and regulation. Because many times what happens is if any of the person on your team does something, I would use the word not legal or illegal work to get some evidences and all things, you may be in a problem for that, not the team member, because there's an agent and principal relationship in that project. I would say. So that is not mentioned in the standard. I'm just trying to give a kind of interpretation from our perspective. And that is something which we need to do that. And if there are any changes of circumstances due to change of terms or scope of work, it happens many times, that you started with this and something else comes up and you have to change everything. So we need to check for very clearly whether do we have necessary skills and competence to perform that assigned work, and do we have time to perform that assigned work. It should not happen that the report is required as of yesterday, and then we try to work on that and work with it. So friends, this is FIS 350. And the last in the series of FIS 300 series is what has been issued very recently. It was not there earlier. It came in the second edition of that, and that is FIS 360, which is testifying before a competent authority. Now, there are many points which are very important in this, but I would like to focus on 3 areas very clearly. The first one is on the scope. Now, if you remember, I talked to you about, there was one exclusion when we were talking about dealing with agencies. This is FA 360 comes where a professional is called upon by a competent authority to function as a fact witness in legal proceeding. You are actually a witness out there who's trying to say this is the fact which is there. And if you are actually trying to, provide FI service to client as part of your exit scope, and where this work is not forming part of your original scope of work, the addendum thing is there. So whenever we are dealing with this, I'll actually directly go in the standard itself, because there are 3 things. There are many things which are very interesting in the standard, and I thought it would be better if I actually go directly into the standard and deal with that. So the first part which I was talking about, it was authority, on the objective. So objective is basically followed by testifying, in terms of a competent authority which is there and managing it up. The requirement is very clear, friends, that the approach which you have to follow is there is no conflict in terms of your witness out there for as expert witness or all of the things, and we need to be clear about that part in terms of how we are dealing with that. And when you are testifying, there is a you should limit the scope of testifying only to the fact and evidence during the course of assignment, not of presumptive thing. This is very important. Why I say it's very important, friends, is because of one reason only. And the reason is that what happens is we have to only state the fact as part of our engagement and not do that. And the last one is to provide impartial testimony. It's not that I was appointed by this gentleman, or he was the person who actually appointed me, and so I should be doing. We have to be impartial, even if we think that as part of the engagement there are some there, maybe the appointing authority has also done something not correct. We have to mention that up clearly. So these are the FAIS friends which are there, the 200 and 300 series, which I think it's each of them are pretty big in itself. But due to the paucity of time, I just try to work on that in a little fast manner. So the 300 series, as I mentioned you, is all on executing assignment. And if we take a kind of a step back and try to see that, the 200 series is all about engagement management. So we start with what are the engagement objectives. We moved on to acceptance and appointment. And we see the using the work of an expert, FIS 230. And 240 is engaging with agencies. And I also mentioned you FIS 240 and 360, when you read it together, it's a very interesting read. And that gives a complete picture out there. 250 is all about communication with stakeholders on the essential matters and significant matters, and how, in what manner we have to do it. If going back to the 300 series, which we started with planning the assignment, because this is all about execution. And here in the planning also, we have a clear idea about laid down procedures and other things, how we will deal with them. The 320 series is about evidence and documentation, one of the most important one, I would say. And you need to give a proper time to this. And it talks about both documentation is different, evidence is different. The terminology which is used extensively is appropriate and reliable evidence, whereas relevant and sufficient documentation has been used. 330 is about the work procedures. How do we do each of the work procedures? And I talked about the hierarchy which is there: engagement, assignment, work procedures. That's how the whole I would say the standard works. And conducting interview, and here I mention it to you, it takes into account both the part, not just interview and interrogation, multiple different types of the thing, depending on what you're trying to achieve as part of the thing, is covered in 340. And 350 is all about review and supervision in the engagement, that there is a proper review and engagement on the engagement has been done, and proper supervision was mentioned and taken care of by way of doing it. And 360 is about testimony before the competition. So friends, that's from my side. I think I have exceeded the time by 3 minutes. Sorry for that, Satish sir. I think that's from my side. Any questions, I'm more than happy to take, or maybe in the last, I'll be here for taking questions. Shailesh Bhai or Amit? Amit ji?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for enlightening the participants. Now I invite CA Satish Shenoy ji to start the proceedings.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, great. So, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
So, very nice. Good afternoon, all the participants. It's soon going to be evening, but what a wonderful start to this webinar by Nandaji at the outset, and Shailesh, who really alluded so well and set the context for the entire standards. Anand continued. I'm a great fan of his lectures, because the way he speaks, it really spans of a lot of work experience that he brings to the table. And he really brought out the aspects of evidence and other aspects that he brought out very well. So today I'm tasked with the activity of talking about the 400 series, which is standards on specialized areas. So there are 3 standards in this. I will not be using any PPT, so I will just be talking, like a discussion in a discussion mode. And at any point in time, Amit, if there are any questions or anything, any comment shows up, please feel free to stop me. It also gives me time to think about what I need to speak about. And I also will use this opportunity to answer or give my viewpoint of what any point has been made. So there are 3 standards on this in this 400 series. It's 410, applying data analysis; 420, evidence discovery in a digital domain. Of course, Anand spoke about evidence, but this is specifically considering what the digital environment today that is present. The evidence discovery in a digital domain. And 430 is about loans or borrowings, those loans and borrowings where some amount of investigation needs to be done. 500 in the 500 series, there is only one standard which has come out, is the 510, which is reporting results. And in the 600 series, it's 610 about quality control. So before I start on the 400 series, which is on the first one being, as I mentioned, applying data analysis, Before that, I thought it's necessary for me to say how the process of these standards was such a beautiful process. And it happened at the time when COVID was at its peak. And a team was formed, and Sailesh, Anand, there were so many people in the team. People came and people went, but there was the core team that stayed together. Harish Dua, led us all so well, and there was so much of support and bonhomie among the team members. And I used to particularly like the way each word in the standard, the amount of time that was spent on each line. There would be different versions coming out of from different people. We not necessarily agreed between us on all the issues. I dare say that we had differences of opinion, but somehow I think as a team we've been able to understand what is best, what is right. It didn't matter who gave the suggestion, but how good the suggestion was. I think that was the victor in the end. And that's why these standards have been written up, in my opinion, pretty well. And in fact, we are very proud, as Nandaji had said in his opening remarks, that we are the first country to come out with these kind of consolidated standards. So kudos to the ICI for having done this, brought this series out. And Amit also has been so helpful in coordinating these meetings, helping us to get, different versions of these standards, the to and fro that went on and on and on. And it was a fantastic experience. So the reason why I'm saying this is that those of you who are in the audience, please use opportunities given by the Institute for your own professional development and for the development of the profession itself. So it's a multiple benefit. It's a win-win situation, according to me. And please devote time for the profession. And thanks for coming and attending this webinar. So Amit, I will conclude. It's at exactly 4:08 now when I'm starting. So I'll take about 6 to 7 minutes per slide, per standard. So I have 5 of them. So I should complete in about 35 minutes. So by about 4:35, 4:40, I should be done. I hope that's okay, Amit. And then we can take questions, and maybe Dayaji is coming and concluding the webinar. I trust that is okay. So let me start with the first standard, which I told you is standard 410. When I say first standard, means it is in the 400 series. I'm talking about the first standard, applying data analysis. Now, the first thing that we want to understand is the application of data analysis techniques to aid the work procedure of the professional. That is why this standard was made, so that we use, how do we apply data analysis? Now, we all understand what is data analytics, what is data analysis, and how important it is in a typical audit. But how important it is in a forensic assignment or a forensic investigation, data analysis is something which is very, very important. What is data analysis in the context of an FAI? It is nothing but to analyze information and discover patterns of irregular and inconsistent activities or other anomalies. Now, when we are doing this forensic investigation, what we need to do is, when we look at data, is to make sure that, what are the outliers? Why are these outliers coming in? If the policy in the company is to have, say, 5 vendors, and each person should be given a common, say 20% of the business, then when we do some data analysis, we understand that somebody is getting 40 and somebody is getting 0. So why is this? What is this? What is the reason? Either upper or below, both we need to kind of analyze. And there are different ways in which these kind of underlying facts really do come out. And the analysis must be done from a data which is part of the accounting system and external sources of the organization at stake. Some of the key definitions, which I think each one of us need to go through the standards, is something called there are many definitions which have been spelled out in the standard. I obviously don't want to allude on all the definitions, but suffice to say that we must understand what is the data source. From where am I getting this specific data for which I'm going to do analysis? How do I acquire this data? What is my process of retrieving data from the company, from wherever it is stored? How do I validate the data? That is data validation. How do I validate? Once I get the data, is it complete? Is it accurate? Is it sufficient? Is the data big enough for me to do an analysis on? What is the data integrity? That is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? What is the steps that I take for data preparation? How do I profile the data? How do I structure the data? Because mere data means nothing. If I just give you a set of numbers, it means nothing. I mean, it's just numbers. It's just values of invoices. It may be just names of the vendors. But how do I profile that data and make meaning out of it? And I think that is the most important part of the data analysis. How do I preserve this data? I need to preserve this data, and Anand also talked about this, that we need to preserve the data because ultimately this data analysis is going to be the basis for our evidence when we actually come to standard 510, when we talk about reports. When we write our reports, it's on the basis of the data analysis that we do. The test of reproducibility, and Shailesh talked about this. That this principle, what is this principle? This principle states that data analysis run on an identified data set should produce the same results in case the same tests are performed by any other competent person on that identified data set. Which means if I do it, or you do it, or Shailesh does it, or Anand does it, the results should be the same. I cannot be told that because I did this extra some process, that is why the result has changed. So the test of reproducibility must be completely fulfilled. Data boundary, on what am I going to really look at the data? Now, the objectives of applying data analysis is to improve the probability of evidence discovery based on intelligence inherent in the data analytics technique, to identify fraud indicators. And Shailesh talked to us about fraud indicators, because fraud indicators require further investigation. Anand also spoke about it in the LFAR. There is the RBI requires us to talk about those accounts where there can be a red flag. So these red flags, it doesn't mean that there is a fraud. A fraud indicator indicates that there is likelihood of something going wrong, and therefore that needs further investigation. And most importantly, this data analysis is required because we get confidence over the reliability of the results. So what is the requirements for a data analysis, and what is prescribed in the standard? Please note that the standards is not, it's from a 30,000 level feet above the, so it's not going to get you into the mechanics of how it is to be done, for which there will be further documentation that will come out. There will be technical guides, as was said in the initial part of today's webinar. So those will follow. So what is the requirement for a data analysis is to prepare and follow a proper data analysis plan, which will contain all the elements as we were talking about. We must also, the professional should also include pre-processing steps. That is, how do I acquire the data? What is the validation? How am I going to prepare the data for my purpose of analysis? What is my data boundary? What are the precautions that I need to take? What are the laws and regulations that I need to follow when I'm picking up data? From where am I picking it? Is that source legal? So all this has to be done properly. And performing the data analysis in line with the objective of the assignment. We have to be clear what is the objective of our assignment, and therefore it is important that we do the data analysis on that particular basis. So that was all about, if I have to, last part of it is that I need to talk about what is the documentation of the work process. So to ensure that I have actually done a proper data analysis, I need to do a couple of things. I need to prepare a data analysis plan, which will be a document which includes all the elements that we have been talking here until now. We should do a data preparation. This document will include file names of relevant data, data acquisition details, chain of custody, and Sailesh told us about the chain of custody. So this is again something which we need to do. We need to have a document which will talk about data analysis procedures and reporting. That is, the document shall record details of analysis performed with logic, algorithm, codes, queries, models used to perform the analysis, along with the log of the procedures performed. This will help us to make sure that our analysis and our results of our analysis will stand the test of the codes. The data preservation, that is how we are going to preserve this data for future access and reference. Please understand, my friends, that in a forensic investigation, forensic assignment, the most important thing is that this is going to be, ultimately, we will have to use this evidence in the court of law, and the law will ask us as professionals to produce whatever work papers, and therefore this is a very important aspect. So this is all about applying data analysis. Let me quickly move on to a number which under the Indian Penal Code is not a very good number, for the standard 420. Okay, and this is not about 420 of the CPC, but it is about the FAIS, and it is evidence discovery in digital domain. It's not, I mean, all of us know that how today how everything has become digital, whether it's because of the COVID or otherwise. Everything, most of the systems have become most of the activities that we do have become digital, and therefore the standard basically came about for discovery of electronic evidence. The electronic evidence must be capable of satisfying the requirements of judicial scrutiny. And at number of points, you will find that in the standards, we'll always be speaking about satisfying the requirements of judicial scrutiny. Okay, so the professional is expected to have or acquire the necessary expertise to undertake e-discovery and conduct assignments in this domain. So if we have this expertise, then it's good. If we do not have the expertise with the team, then we may have to borrow this by using the work of an expert, which also has been spoken about. There are a couple of definitions which are very important for us to know. The first one is the digital domain. This is nothing but the electronic environment where the digital evidence is present. We may call it the IT systems, we may call it the information systems, we may call it cyberspace, we may call it just about anything. Rose by any other name smells as sweet. But the digital domain is nothing but the entire ecosystem where the digital evidence is present. Digital evidence or DE. This term refers to the data or information acquired, stored, assessed, examined, transmitted, and used in electronic form. Digital evidence needs to comply with the applicable laws and proper chain of custody in order to be admissible as evidence in a court of law. Pardon me for repeating this time and again. This chain of custody is required. This admission as an evidence in the court of law is something which is very important. E-discovery or the electronic discovery. The process used for gathering and collecting evidence in the digital domain is nothing but e-discovery. Digital chain of custody. This refers to the procedures applied to track the sequential movement of evidence through the discovery process from collection, storage, securing, safeguarding, and analysis life cycle. Each step is recorded, and each person who handled the evidence is documented, noting the date and time it was collected, stored, transferred, and the purpose of such transfers. So this is a very, very important thing, and which any system, you know that when that particular transaction got done, from which IP address it came, who did this transaction, from which ID this transaction got logged, what was the changes that were made, so all these things are recorded in that log. And finally, the digital footprint, just as there are physical footprints, and when a person walks in and walks out, there are footprints. Likewise, this term refers to the unique set of actions and activities, including communications, recorded on the digital domain or devices, which can be traced to a particular user. Just as Anand was saying, you can make out from the person's Google map where the person was, when did he go, when did he come, when did he or she, and when I say he, I mean he and she, he or she, so all those evidences are typically which is available. So what are the objectives, if I may have to say, on this, or for the reason for this standards? We have to consider the unique risk factors in e-discovery of evidence. We also need to spell out the limitations and steps required to mitigate or manage those risks, like a typical risk management process. We find out what the risk is, we find out what the controls are, we find out what the gap is, and how do we mitigate those risks? How do we close or shorten the gap or minimize the gap? The most important thing is that we need to evaluate the resources, skills, and the timeline required for the evidence discovery. So what are the requirements for doing all of this? The requirement is simple, that the professional, that the investigator, that the person to whom the standard applies shall maintain and deploy a documented process for e-discovery of evidence. And this is very, very important, documented process. He or she will undertake an overall understanding of the prevailing information system environment and its linkage to the digital domain. You have to walk through the entire IT system to understand how the data is getting captured, what are the linkages across the organization, and this has to be understood very well. The discovery and gathering process shall be conducted by those who have the requisite skills, expertise, and experience of working in such a domain so as to preserve the reliability and admissibility of digital evidence in a court of law. So you can't do a wishy-washy job out of it. Not that anybody comes to work to do a wishy-washy job. I'm not even thinking about that. What I'm trying to say is that we must be, if we are going to be in this domain, we must have the requisite skills. And if we do not have it, then we need to buy it. We need to make sure that people with the best of experience and skills are available, because my friends, this has to stand the test of the law. The most important thing in this evidence gathering is we must comply with the domestic laws or international laws wherever applicable concerning the digital domain and respective data privacy laws, which place restriction on the e-discovery and custody of digital evidence. Like bank statements, Sailesh was saying that you can't make somebody look out of the window and then snap his bank statements or something like that. And you can't be doing all these things. There are laws and we need to follow the law. Otherwise, tomorrow, when these are presented as evidence, the court will turn and start the case against us, not against, because how did you get this evidence when it was, you are not supposed to be having this information. And the last and the most important thing is that the professional will deploy appropriate forensic tools and techniques to authenticate the evidence, analyze the data, and maintain a reliable chain of custody over the evidence. So this is something which is very, very important so far as digital evidence is concerned. So far as the documentation is concerned, The digital the domain process documentation shall be maintained, considering all the steps that we talked about, and the assignment documentation shall include the chain of custody. This is something which is very, very important. So with this, I have completed 420. Now what I'll take up is the 430, which is loans or borrowings. So the need for this standard came because of, we know so many loans and borrowings which have gone bad. There have been different misuse of funds, and I'll talk something about it, which is actually coming out in the standard. So this is specific type of engagements relating to disputed transactions of loans or borrowings. It pertains to, I repeat, disputed transactions. Okay. It requires an examination of compliance with contractual, statutory, or regulatory provisions of loans and borrowings. Now, what is loans and borrowings? Loans and borrowings could be both funded and non-funded facilities which have been sanctioned and disbursed or accepted to pay in certain circumstances by the lender. Okay. Misutilization of funds. Now, misutilization of funds means that the intended purpose for which the person had borrowed, those funds are not being utilized as per the intended purpose or as per the agreed terms and conditions. Fund utilization may be on activities unrelated to the operations and activities of the business. It could be used for something which is unrelated to the operations and activities. Or it could be to the detriment of the financial health of the entity. It is assumed here that the professional is familiar with the applicable laws, applicable regulations of the Reserve Bank of India and other laws as spelled out in laws and regulation in FAIS 130. And RBI is an important aspect or regulator that we need to be wary of while we are talking about these standards. And this is applicable to all transactions of loans extended by financial or other institutions or by individuals, including but not limited to banking and NBFCs as well. So what are the objectives of this particular standard? The objectives of this standard are to discover evidences, gather facts, and report on what? Report on the nature of loans or borrowing transactions and the nature and reasons for which they have come under dispute. Violations and intent with respect to availment and utilization of the funds during the life cycle of the loan. These are the two important objectives of this particular standard. Let us quickly turn around to what are the requirements for this particular standard. So the professional shall identify and confirm the nature of dispute. What is the primary stakeholders' expectation and agree on the scope and requirement of the engagement. This is very, very important. Just as Anand was talking in FAIS 220 on engagement, acceptance, and appointment. It is very, very important that you agree on the scope and requirement of the assignment, addressing specifically the unique aspects of each appointing agency, such as an RP, lending bank, or an investigation agency. We must be very clear what we are keeping out of scope, and this must be clearly brought out in the letter of engagement or appointment. Compliance with legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements is a key aspect of this particular as a part of our job. Asset tracing shall be considered to identify the flow of transactions in dispute through diversion or siphoning. So asset tracing could also be one of the aspects that we may have to look at. And the professional must also ensure that they take reasonable efforts to collect additional data or additional information from other sources, which goes far beyond accounting records and which are made available by the appointing agencies. So the evidences must be corroborated from all angles. I think that is the most important aspect of um, this particular standard. So when we are looking at these standards, we must look at any loans which have been extended through inappropriate or unethical means, assets which are offered as security are not owned, do not exist, misappropriated, funds are not utilized as per the contractual terms and all conditions. They are misutilized. The loans, the funds have been taken, but misutilized in a fraudulent manner. Falsified documents given for fund utilization, or for when documents are given for the purpose of the loan. Disputes relating to timely repayment of the loan, and all these things must be clearly looked at. Asset tracing. I think asset tracing, I must talk at least for about half a minute on this, because asset tracing is designed to discover the trail of the money, the assets offered as securities, and any other assets or activities created out of diversion of the funds. The professional may need to trace the movement of the funds from the point of disbursement to their ultimate utilization. And that is very, very essential, because you need to see whether any round tripping has happened from the money came to a particular entity. Where did the money move from there? To which entity did it go? Why did it go? Was it for the purpose for which the intended purpose for which the loan was given? How did this transaction really move? So all these important aspects of fund diversion techniques have to be looked at very, very carefully. And whether transactions are at arm's length, the professional will need to use market intelligence, look at the digital footprint which is there, look at social media, conduct field investigations, perform integrity due diligence checks, and the works. There is so many other evidences which is being brought out in the very beautifully brought out in the standard. And last but not the least, look at the possible to perceived nexus between the borrower and the loan sanctioning authority. And wherever necessary, if we do not have the expertise to do a particular task, then at that stage, we must look at FAIS 230 using the work of an expert, and look at the need to engage other professionals and make sure that this is looked at. So the documentation for this is that the professional shall gather and maintain documents which confirm the lender-borrower relationship and the true nature of the relationship. Sorry, maintain all necessary documents relating to the disputed transaction, and obtain and maintain documents from the lender, the borrower, and the appropriate authority. So that's about standard 400. Let me quickly move on to an important standard, which is the standards on reporting. Okay, so the standards on reporting, there is only one standard which has come out in the 500 series, which is the 510 on reporting results. Now, this is one of the very important standards, because this is the finale, the grand concluding part of the assignment, or the assignment is nothing but the report that the investigator will issue. So, and I remember while the standard was being written, there was so much back and forth that this standard went into, because this is the important aspect. Just as Anand talked about conducting the assignment. I think after conducting the assignment and getting all evidences and doing data analysis and ultimately doing all of that, the report is the most, what you report, how you report is the most important aspect of the entire assignment. And the standard talks about issuing a written report to the stakeholders at the conclusion of the assignment. Okay. And if there are, sometimes one engagement may have multiple assignments, then we may have to issue multiple reports, one for each assignment. We must look at what was the engagement objectives, what was written, what was mentioned in FAIS 220 on engagement acceptance and appointment, and our report must be in line with the engagement objectives. Okay. The scope of this standard will apply to all FAI engagements unless the need for a written report is expressly excluded through engagement terms. For example, in litigation support engagements, which Sailesh was talking about. So what's the objectives of this standard? The objectives is that a written report is issued at the completion of an assignment. 1. 2. Results derived from a reliable and relevant evidence discovery process is captured in the report. 3. The report incorporates relevant key elements with applicable assumptions and limitations. And the fourth one is that the report communicates in sufficient detail how the engagement mandate is fulfilled. So what are the requirements for fulfillment of this standards? The report must be precise and unambiguous. It must be addressed to the primary stakeholder and shared with other stakeholders if required or otherwise permissible. There is no fixed form or content of the audit report, but my friends, it must contain key elements to enable the recipient to understand the purpose of the assignment, the extent and scope of the work performed, any limitations, assumptions, or disclaimers that the professional wants to really spell out, the facts and evidence discovered, and the conclusions drawn. I think I'll repeat this. It must contain the key elements to enable the recipient to understand the purpose of the assignment, the extent and scope of the work performed, any limitations, assumptions, or disclaimers, the facts and evidence discovered, and the conclusions drawn. Where in a particular assignment, the form and content of the report is mandated, then obviously the report must be made in line with those requirements. But however, keeping in mind the key elements which I repeated twice. Where the mandate of the engagement requires a discussion of the findings with the management, then a summary of the responses received shall be included in the report. Just as we said earlier, that justice cannot be given just from one side, but both sides have to be heard. And that is why this particular aspect is there. The report shall highlight any key assumptions made and whether there was any limitations which affected the results of the assignment. And this must be clearly brought out so as to evaluate the impact on the conclusions. Now, here's a very important aspect of the report. The report shall not express an opinion or pass any judgment on the guilt or innocence. Determination of culpability is either a disciplinary process internal to the organization under review or a judicial process, depending on the specific situation. The report at best can highlight the circumstances and facts that may aid a stakeholder decision or further a civil or a criminal investigation. So it is not it's not for us to pass any judgment on the guilt or innocence. If in certain circumstances where the assignment could not be completed due to unforeseen or unavoidable reasons, then the professional shall provide a status report with an assessment of the results, including due limitations and disclaimers and reasons for the incomplete nature of the assignment. The most important thing is that the report must be issued within a reasonable time frame. What is reasonable will depend on time and each circumstance. So just to conclude this part, the key elements of the report shall include the title, addressee, distribution list, scope, objectives, broad approach, the approach and broad work procedures, executive summary of the results, reference to use of an expert wherever it was used, the fact that this assignment has been conducted in accordance with the FIAs, list of findings, assumptions, limitations, and disclaimers, and conclusions, if any, drawn from the assignment undertaken. I already talked about discussion of the draft report, assumptions, reporting timelines. As I said, at times it may be important, it may be necessary for us to provide interim reports. If it's a longer kind of an assignment or there is something very important that needs to be reported, then these interim reports also shall is subject to these particular standards. The documentation of the work process is that the findings have to be in the report shall be duly supported by appropriate evidence. The copies of the draft report, final report, interim reports, all of that has to be maintained in accordance with FAIS 320, which is evidence and documentation, and relevant communication and documentation trail which supports limitations, disclaimers, and assumptions shall form part of the work papers. So this is about 510, and the last part of the topic that was given to me was on the 600 series, and I'm about 4 minutes short because this will take precisely 4 minutes. It's already 4:40. So this will, so Amit, if you pardon me, I'll just take 3 or 4 minutes more and I'll close by about 4:45. So this is the last standard which has come out in this series. It's a 600 series. I did 600 and 610, which is on quality control. And this was to ensure a consistent approach for an acceptable quality of work performed. The stakeholders are the best judges of acceptable quality, of what is acceptable quality. And we have to remember that our FAI assignments generally will have multiple stakeholders, and we must recognize their expectations of quality, each stakeholder's expectation. So delivering quality output requires a systematic and a disciplined approach. And therefore, this requires a combination of the right people, robust processes, and a brilliant quality control system, which is there. So the objectives is that we must have a quality control requirement, should be in place, should be well understood. The work performed by the professional and their staff follows a systematic and disciplined approach to achieve the quality control requirements. It also covers two aspects, the quality control review and the CPE, the continuing professional education, which today I think all of us are in this particular forum by attending this particular forum. So there are few things that we need to have. The professional shall establish a quality control system, QCS, which specifies the quality control requirements, which will be met at different stages of the assignment. That the assignments are appropriately staffed with individuals having relevant experience and technical capabilities. Just as Anand was talking about that his experience of that railway electrification and track laying experience that he was talking about. And the professional shall establish policies and procedures for the QCR and monitoring the continuing professional education. The standard, of course, spells out that for FAI, at least five of the annual CPRs should be in the FAI domain. I think today, 3 of those 5 have already been ticked off for all of us who have attended this program. And finally, the quality control, this system must be at all aspects of the assignment. It must be before accepting the assignment. We must ensure independence, skills and competencies, appropriateness of the scope and objectives. During the execution, the objectivity of the work performance, especially through application of hypotheses wherever applicable, processes for complying with applicable FAISs, especially regarding the review and supervision of quality of work performed, quantity of evidence discovered and its linkage with conclusion drawn and report. Before completing the assignment, an independent review of quality parameters before issuing the report. Post completion of the assignment, an independent quality review of a sample of assignments. An independent peer review type of mechanism, at least once in 3 years, as the standard spells out, to review the whole quality control system. Continuously review and improve the QCS. Staff capabilities and competencies, professional education, CPE, on-the-job work, coaching are some of the things that this standard recommends. So I think this is the documentation. We should have our policies and procedures in the form of a QCS and a QCR manual, and all relevant correspondence and communication documentation which evidences that sufficient quality control procedures were performed. So with that, I will conclude this particular aspect of the task that was given to me. So thank you very much for your patient hearing. If there are any questions, I think Sailesh is also there. I don't know whether our friend Anand is there, but Sailesh and I are available. Amit is also there. More than happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes, Amit. Amit, I think you're on mute. I think Amit is on mute.
He has just sent me some questions. Okay. The first one is interesting. How to develop a career in fraud? I presume they mean in fraud detection. I guess I will give my take. It's an interesting question which applies to everybody. So Satish can give his perspective from industry. As a practicing accountant, I, for one, would feel very upset if there was a fraud opportunity investigation with one of my clients and they actually gave it to somebody else. So, like in most things in our profession, you get it by word of mouth. And usually, let's look at 2 or 3 types of assignments. In the private sector, they won't give it unless they trust you. They want to be very sure that confidentiality, secrecy will be maintained, company image, customer brand loyalty, all those should not be impacted. So that is one. When you come to the larger public sector ones, you need to be empaneled, you need to be big. Otherwise, it's difficult. And I think the Institute has come up with multiple ways to get you empaneled in terms of form large firms, form associations, form networks. So there are options to become a bigger firm. And the reason why people don't form bigger firms, I guess, is they want to retain their individuality. I am guilty of that too. But then you work for larger firms on an assignment basis. So there are many ways in which you can pursue a career. And maybe from an industry perspective, Satish can tell us what he looks for.
Certainly. I think it's all about a bouquet of services. I mean, if I was to just talk a little bit about practitioners, I think it's a bouquet of services. So if your bouquet of services includes, fraud as well, fraud detection and fraud prevention and what have you, I think it becomes very essential, and the firm looks very rounded, better rounded for. And as Silas said, if in case some assignment doesn't come to us, it looks a pretty. So, and there are ways to do it. As you can say, you can get experts working for you. You can get in industry what is now becoming very important because of the way things are happening. The lifestyle changes are happening. People are. I'm not saying that there's a degradation, but all that I'm saying is that there is a lot of importance that has been given. If you see in the first, say, 3/4 of my career, I never had this kind of focus on fraud detection. I'm being very frank, and but in the last 1/4 of my of my career, I saw that as a chief audit head, I have been also focusing on fraud investigation, and that became an essential part of my job. And at that point in time, let me be very frank, I did not have those skills. So we need to understand, we need to unlearn, learn, relearn, and all those typical things that are said. But let me tell you this, that there is a huge scope for this in this area. Fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know what to say, but there is a huge scope, and it must not be the only thing that you do. I also admit to say that unless you want to completely deep dive into fraud investigation, but there is a lot of scope, and people are really looking out for focused kind of investigation. So all the best to the person who has asked this question. Good question, and all the best to you.
There's another very interesting one. By coming out with standards, the fraudster knows exactly what we are going to do and how are we going to do it. And when the technical and other guides come, they will get more information. So does this make our life more difficult or does it make our life easy?
So my first reaction to this, and Sailesh, maybe you can talk about it. That way, when you there are 1 million road accidents that happen every day, 1 million, whatever, but it's a huge number. That doesn't mean I'll not drive a car, right? There are many road accidents that happen when you cross a road. That doesn't mean I don't cross the road. I do whatever I need to do to make sure that there are ways I don't go to dangerous places where people drive dangerously or whatever, but I keep a safe distance. And there are various ways in which you can to do this. This is my quick and dirty, spontaneous reaction. Maybe Sailesh, if you
that was an excellent way of putting it. The way I'd answer this is there are two parts to anything which becomes a standard. One part is the preventive part. The other part is the detection part. Now, what the standards do, if you follow this methodology, things are going to be easier to catch. So, yes, the perpetrators are going to get a little cleverer, but it's also going to make it much more difficult to perpetrate a fraud and get away. So there are both sides to it. And the other thing is, I always tell this when I do an investigation or discuss with colleagues like this forum. There are two types of data which are available to you. One data is what I call organization internal. There's another data which I call organization external. On organization external, the organization doesn't have too much control. That is my primary source of information to investigate. Multiple examples. The factory is doing very well. Electricity bill is what I look at. Production is very high. I will go into the installed and running capacities of the machines. If production is high, multi-shift is there, I'd like to go and see the biometrics for people attending the factory. If somebody is showing a very high debt, the least I would go and see is go to the MCS site and show whether that guy is showing that much credit at least. So among the many things people can do, there are lots of things they can't do. There is information available. Anand covered a lot of it on social media, geotagging. I am not the tech-savvy guy that Anand is, so I am very traditional for numbers. So, but even for the traditional guys like us, there's lots of information available. And especially if you do loan-related investigations, there's a lot of things people write when they apply for a loan. You'll be surprised when you look at the loan papers. And that gives me a very good idea when I look, and this is what they said the company would be, and this is where the company is when we look at their projections. So don't worry about them knowing your methodology. The devil is always in the details.
Yes.
So nothing to worry.
In fact, banks are coming out with there is a report that comes about how the frauds, what all types of frauds were done. In fact, in one of the audit committees, one of the directors said that this becomes a, for people who don't know how to do frauds, this becomes a guide. But so be it. I mean, so be it.
Okay, and there's another question which is also a very good one. If I understand the gist of it, it's a very long question. What should be the stand of the professional if they find that data analytics actually frees the accused? They've given an example. All right. I will give my take as an investigator. And it's very interesting that Satish gives his take as a person who appointed the investigator, then you will get both sides of the answer. So there is a stakeholder who has appointed me. And for simplicity's sake, let's say it's a bank. And they have initiated all kinds of action against the borrower. And it's very embarrassing for them if I come up with a report saying I could not find anything fraudulent. And instead, I come up with lots of instances where information was provided to the bank which was not acted upon. I also find instances of lapses by the bank. And I also find that basically the loan goes bad. Let's say COVID is a good example. It's a largely import-driven company, so the currency problem is another example. Logistics was a major problem during COVID. So we put those and say, prima facie, we didn't find anything fraudulent, but obviously my prime stakeholder is not happy with the answer. So the answer to the question as an investigator, I would still give that answer because I am there to give the facts as they are. Now, the question which obviously is hidden in this is, what if the stakeholder doesn't pay?
Oh.
That is the hidden question, which obviously he has not put in paper. But I guess in the end, the stakeholder will pay.
He has to.
I mean, I don't want to discuss those here, but as working professionals, we have multiple ways in which there is one person who is not giving the money, for example. Organizations have hierarchies. We can take the hierarchies. They are regulators. And in this case, I think you would get it.
Yes.
But yeah, the perspective which the person is looking for, I think, is of the appointer. Suppose you got a report you didn't like. How does one react?
See, this aspect also comes when you get some, suppose like I'm in the industry and I'm doing some investigation and I find that there is something coming against the management itself. Now I need to report it to whom? I need to report it to that same management, right? It's not that I'm going to report to an external guy. I'm the employee of that company. I'm giving my perspective. So what do? You need to find out. So management say, yeah, don't report like this, don't do like this. What will the board think? What will he think? And what will he think? We'll take some action against the guy. We'll change his job role or whatever. So at that time, I think you need to use your judgment whether you want your job is more important or your principles are more important or what is it. And like this kind of duality will keep showing up. It shows up in small things as well. Even in internal audit reports, when you write something and there is some opportunity of cost saving or something, not a fraud, just an opportunity, big opportunity. And like if it is really presented in the correct way to the audit committee will think, how did these people goof up so badly? How did they miss this? So and the management says, don't report it here, we'll take care of it, we have already taken care of it, we have done this, we have done that, we have already saved that money has already come back, why do you want to report it? So you need to report it because this is a very serious. So these kind of dualities will keep showing up because ultimately independence is a state of mind. You need to, there is no definitions. If you do these 10 things means you are independent. If you do these 15 things, then your objectivity is protected. I think it's a lot to do with these circumstances, a lot to do with your own philosophy of life, of how do you look at these things and how do you talk. That's my take on it.
Satish, that's an excellent point because the question is actually much broader than fraud.
Yeah.
And you raise the right point on reporting to maybe a board or a committee.
Yes.
Because the minute it gets into a board minute,
yes,
or an audit committee or a finance committee minute, that particular lack of control is highlighted for all to see. So then it basically becomes, which means if it's a public sector, it's available to CAG. It's available to statutory audit. It's available if the company has taken a loan to the bank person who regulates or reviews the loan and does the investigation. So there is a lot of apprehension on what is exactly going into the presentation you make at senior levels. And like Satish so beautifully put it, fraud is one part of it. And this addition, I think we will have to keep taking day in and day out, because we are in that profession, and I'm sure all of us find our way of getting the right balance between doing what is right and not offending the other people unnecessarily. We are not here to make enemies, we are here to present facts. And I think in the end, if what you do is in the interest of the organization or the assignment, in the end, people will see your point of view. But no, only advice I will give from my experience, don't be unpleasant about the way you put the facts. Satish has a fabulous smile. We should all replicate it most of the time. That way people will listen to everything.
जोर का धक्का धीरे से.
So do it with a smile is my advice. Yes, Kunal Bhai or Amit, I think this is the questions which were sent to me. Is there anything else?
Yeah, sir. These are the questions which we have received, sir. So now
there is one on CPE hours, which I think you should take. I will not be able to take that.
CPE hours. क्या लिखा है भाई?
no issues, sir. No issues, sir. On that we will take it. So, sir, thank you very much, sir. And we will continue these type of VCMs in future. And thank you very much, sir. And I hope that all the participants have learned a lot from this VCM. And we will definitely organize these type of VCMs very soon. And we will send details to all the members to participate in these type of VCM. Because forensic accounting and investigation standards will become mandatory from 1st April 2023. Oh. So all the members are requested to participate in these type of VCMs. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.